Going into this trip, I was feeling a little uncertain about it. In February, I was laid off from my job when the company basically made all R&D teams redundant. I wasn't sure I should go, but in the end I figured it might do me some good to get away for a bit. There are two options when travelling to Boston if you want to take a direct flight from the Bay Area. You either leave very early in the day and then arrive on the East Coast around late afternoon local time, or you leave the night before and arrive stupidly early local time. I opted for the first option. I've done the reverse in the past and found it pretty tough to adjust. You end up wandering around Boston at 6 a.m. with all your stuff, hoping the hotel will let you in, feeling like death. You either try and stay awake, or you end up sleeping early, and it feels like you don't adjust as easily. The other option is also tiring and disruptive, but you arrive at a reasonable check-in time, and then you eat something and you crash. I had to fly from San Francisco as my local airport didn't offer direct flights. I dislike flying and tried to just get it out of the way in one go and not mess around with changing planes if I can avoid it. So I had a flight from 8 a.m. from SFO. That meant getting there in good time, and it's about 45 minutes to an hour drive to the airport from my place, depending on traffic. And at that time in the morning, it's going to be fairly quiet. I like to allow a lot of time for the whole airport security nonsense, so I left at about 5 a.m. taking an Uber over to the airport. My driver seemed a nice enough chap. He had this habit of pulsing the throttle a lot, and there seemed to be an alarming number of lights lit on his dashboard, but he got me there safe and on time. I was flying out of Terminal 2, which I don't think I've done before, and I was flying Alaska Air. It was busy getting through security, but it was moving, and I got to the gate about an hour before the boarding at 7:20 a.m. They immediately asked for people to check their bags at the gate. This was free and bumped you up to a premium boarding group. Since I had already checked my bag and paid $30 for the privilege, it felt a bit put out by that. I could have just saved myself some money. I was in one of the premium seats, which supposedly had more legroom and an earlier boarding, and it was comfy enough as these things go. The flight was pretty much full. All seats on my row were occupied. I did my best to sleep and managed to snooze a little, doing the sort of falling asleep and jerking awake thing on repeat for about an hour or so. You had to pay for any sort of meal, and even then it was sort of cheese and crackers sort of thing, so I didn't bother. They gave us a few drinks and then a few biscuits, but nothing substantial. When we arrived at Boston about 5 hours later, it was a fairly nice day, cool but not cold, and there was some sunshine. I got my bag and I boarded the Silver Line bus to downtown. It was absolutely packed with people, floor to ceiling. My stop was first, and after some shuffling, I got off with my bags at the World Trade Center stop. And then it was just a short walk to my hotel, the Omni Boston Seaport. I was on the 10th floor of the Patron Tower and had a pretty good view at the downtown and the convention center, which is literally just across the road. I settled in, got some food, and then got some sleep, ready for day one of PAX East. Day one. I got woken by the cleaners hammering on the door at 9 a.m, which to my body clock was 6 a.m, and probably worse given the lack of sleep from the last couple of days. This is partially due to the flight, but also due to postponed interviews that meant I lost 2 days of sleep to an early start, and then the resulting anxiety and nonsense. They said they would come back later, and I got a bit more sleep, then at around 10 a.m. got myself going and headed over to the convention center. Looking out from my room, I couldn't see any sort of queue, and when I got down there, it was pretty much straight in. They had updated the metal detectors for a more modern setup, rather than the previous bank of machines that required you to remove everything and hand over your bag. These ones you just sort of walk through with all your stuff, and then they only did a search if you set it off. After breezing through, I headed for the queue for the main theatre, and was surprised to find maybe 20 people waiting, if that. So few people were there that I could sit on one of the benches, and there was still room for loads of people. The queue barely got round the first corner. They let us in at about 11:45, and it hadn't really picked up many more people. There were enough to sort of sparsely fill the centre section of chairs up to about the 6th row. I sat about halfway to the front on the left aisle, and could have got closer if I'd felt like it. It seemed pretty empty, even given it was a Thursday and given this was post-COVID. The keynote was an interview between CEO of Ilphonic, Charles Bruntgard, and Liam Richardson, a video producer at Rock Paper Shotgun. It was a fairly interesting tale of how he grew up wanting to make games and so learned programming at a fairly young age and then got internships at various businesses and mentored as a result, but then taking a completely different direction and becoming a music producer for some fairly big names. Later on he got fed up with the music business and went into indie games, founding Ilphonic. They had some success but became a studio for hire working on bits and pieces of other people's games. Eventually these relationships got them the Friday the 13th game, and then basically made them what they are. Since then they've worked on various IPs like Predator or Ghostbusters and made a name for themselves in the area of sort of asymmetric multiplayer games. It was an interesting talk showing this guy's very non-linear path into games, something he wanted for a young age but took him a long while to achieve, although it seemed the various relationships he made along the way and the things he'd done got him there eventually, paving the way. Next up was the PA Q&A, number 1, most delicious, enjoy.
PAX East, 2023, welcome home, etc. That's it. That's the, hope you enjoyed the intro track, thank you. Thank you so much. And I would be remiss if I didn't thank Laura, the whole team, everybody. PAX is in one more hour, and that's the whole show. You might want to have somebody go get your car out now.
No, it's closed now. The garage is closed.
Oh, you can't.
Now.
You will have to come and get your car tomorrow.
Yeah.
What a great pleasure it is.
Jerry and Chris took to the stage to answer the cues with some A's, and I think the audience actually increased for this, which is the reverse of what often happened. More people being familiar with PAX as a show than Penny Arcade itself. The construction of the question-giving stand seemed to be a mock-up of a CRT or an old-school TV. It would fit in with the VHS theme of the show's livery. They were asked for their favourite plant. Jerry talked about a bush covered in bugs that wiggled to deter birds, and Chris talked about mushrooms that make up the majority of the life on the planet, neither of which is actually a plant. They were asked to detail a one-shot RPG they would like to do in a system other than the ones they've used before, and it couldn't be Acquisitions Incorporated. They talked about Star Trek, which prompted Jerry to ask Chris about his love of the show. Jerry was asked to mimic Chris, which was tried, but the conclusion being that they were polar opposites. They made the noise of a modem linking up.
I think that would be the ultimate challenge.
I think it would actually require two people.
Oh yeah, to get the two modes, right?
Ultimately, we require, here, so, do you want to make the hawk like shriek? And then as no, the high pitch, like the shriek.
Yeah.
And then I will come in with the white noise hiss underneath it. So I'll do the dial, and then you
There's a couple
make the shriek.
ones, though. Because there's also the one that goes, beep, beep, beep. Then right?
Oh yeah.
Maybe you get your white noise.
The 56K, oh shit.
That's how you know.
Oh shit. No, here, so I will dial,
Okay.
and then you want to shriek, and then you keep shrieking, and then I'm going to add the hiss underneath it.
Okay.
Right?
Go ahead.
They talked about how, to the current youth of today, memes like Badger Badger are sort of historical texts, ancient artifacts that formed the memes of today, but also how they are going back to things like 80s commercials and absorbing them in a similar fashion, quoting taglines often with no knowledge or experience of the product they were originally made for. Jerry was brought to his knees by the existential horror of a question that stated, "Why did you abandon some project beyond lack of interest?" He wished he could make songs again, and someone laughed, but it felt like it wasn't really a laughing matter. At one point, they posed as if on a Beastie Boys cover for the camera. They talked about the problems of shipping beer after a question about the possibility of Acquisitions Intoxicated Beer of the Month Club. You can apparently only ship beer to 13 states due to laws that date back to the 1920s. Jerry described some horror of the work Chris did, his creepy Local 58, which I think I've seen one of and was profoundly unsettling. They also talked about the logo on Gabe's shirt, which was first mentioned in the question as legally distinct Pac-Man logo, which Chris said can't be legally distinct if it's called Pac-Man, which itself is a trademark. It is apparently officially just the Gabe logo, and indeed when Namco did Gabe as a special character for some fighting game, they had to secure the rights to use the logo in their game. IP lore is completely crazy. It was a great time, lots of laughs, and some soul-destroying. Next, I headed to the merch booth, grabbed a few things, and then headed back via the shops, grabbing a spot of lunch. I watched a panel on content creation, maybe because it was the only thing running at the time, and then played some games and fell asleep. Later, I then headed to the secret Club PA meetup, and there I was given some exclusive Club PA goodies. Brian Hartman was there, seemingly against his will, to ensure Jerry didn't reveal any juicy secrets, like he apparently did at the last couple of meetups. He supposedly had plans for a business dinner, but put them aside so he was present to snatch away the mic if Jerry started spilling the beans. He admonished us not to tempt Jerry, which of course we all did. Jerry rolled in a bit later after that, mentioning he had been enjoying the new Voodoo Ranger PA collab. It is apparently quite strong, and as a result he was liable to spill the secrets, hence the need for Ryan. I don't think he spilled any beans. He did talk at length about various subjects, sometimes related to the questions or even just statements from the audience. It was a fun time. After that, I headed back to the hotel, grabbed some food, watched one of the concerts, or part of it, that seemed like someone was playing the Street Fighter movie to a sort of backbeat. Day 2. Not a great morning as I managed to spill coffee on my laptop. Initially it seemed fine, but as it turned out maybe not so fine. The day seemed a bit busier than yesterday, but it was still hard to tell. First up, I had Q&A Part 2 with Jerry and Chris. Some fun stuff. The first thing was a panic note from the Hydrox Cookie Company, demanding they sample the cookies that had been provided in a previous session. There had been a pack on stage yesterday, but they had been ignored because it sounded like some sort of industrial cleaning product. As it turned out, they're just sort of like Oreos, which I would argue is pretty much an industrial cleaning product.
No, this is a streaming thing. Asthma. All right, hang on a second. Okay. I think that sometimes it's ASMR and sometimes it's not. I think that if you have a special binaural microphone that looks like two human ears and you chew it constantly, I think that might be ASMR. I think Chris and I eating these cookies is going to be something like the inverse, but I'm willing to try.
RMSA, which sounds like a flu, sounds like influenza. You gotta tap the package, just go Now I'm hungry. Just a little bit slower.
I swear to God, I'm not trying to tantalize you with these. I did not open the aperture thoroughly enough, and now I think I'm afraid I've destroyed the bulk of these cookies. Now they've become a kind of powder.
Yeah, I was gonna say, you just smash
We're gonna have to snort
and then just
these fucking cookies right here. I love that the bar is subterranean for me. I love that it's fine that I took a cookie out. Right here, yeah.
cookie for me.
Yeah. Now, I feel like these have got a lot of stuff in them.
There's a lot of cream filling.
But yeah, there's an industrial substrate sort of between the two layers.
I'm worried that, here's my concern, is that I already have like a very dry mouth. And I'm doing a lot of like, into the mic. This is not gonna help. It's gonna completely desiccate.
No. It's full desiccation. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Nice hot mustard. Oh, it's hot, spicy.
You taste like an Oreo.
It's burning my tongue.
Is that
I'm full.
Is that what it's supposed to be like?
Yeah. Yep.
I feel like we went a long way for not a whole lot of return.
Gonna dip it. Gonna work. I need
Okay, I ate your
moisture.
cookie. It tastes like a cookie.
Thoroughly edible.
Yeah.
That's on the package.
All right.
That's a promise.
Then there was an envelope matryoshka containing several smaller envelopes with their own envelopes, some with Chris's face inside, and then finally a slightly bigger version of Chris's face.
Still tiny meat. Can we get that up on still score?
Here, now,
We got,
is,
okay. Still tiny
no,
meat?
hold on. Is this a larval, Chris?
This is from a child's play.
Is this the larval state?
Ooh, what's a weight? I don't like that progression, nightmare logic.
It might molt.
Oh no,
What the hell?
more came in.
Okay, so
When you got one, there's 10 that you don't see.
So we have an infestation. It's like, see, this is your problem right here. You got too many goddamn Chris crowds.
They just keep getting larger.
Okay, now this one's bigger. I don't like that.
It does follow the preferred, horror and comedy nightmare turn of the setup, the pledge, the turn, the prestige. That was the last one. The treat was a larger meat. That was the reward I had received.
But just slightly larger.
It's a little bit.
Not too big.
20%.
Just enhance, but retain the ratio. AJ, just click the box, people.
They were asked about their pets. Chris had a dog, which seemed quite anxious. Jerry has a dog that is the anti-mailman, and a cat called Hercule Poirot that rules the neighborhood. He will be in other people's houses, and visiting contractors will know his name. Each pet also had a song. There was some Acquisitions Incorporated stuff. Someone asked what to do with the increasing number of Spider-Men, perhaps repair the aging power grid. Yes was the answer. They were asked what their first memory of joy was. Chris detailed being baptized as a baby as his first memory, but no joy there. Jerry mentioned his daughter tidying her room because her crush was coming over. There was a question about the Time 100. Jerry mentioned how weird it was, how the photographers saw them on the red carpet, raised their cameras, saw they were nobodies, then lowered the cameras again. He mentioned that at their table was someone who fired all the teachers in a district. The final question in the last minute was how they came up with the theme for PAX, so frantic answering ensued. Mostly about how they pick out the theme and then have to make it work with all the colours. Checking with Unplugged and Oz that have the most extreme with yellow and purple colours, then seeing if it works with West and East, which are blue and red and tend to just work. After that, I went to a panel on getting into the game industry. Since I'm looking for a job, I decided it couldn't hurt to see what advice they had. And there were some interesting tidbits. One of the panels suggests taking all the keywords for a job and putting them in a sub-layer on your resume, making them white on white so no human sees them, but any AI filtering will pick up on them. Most of the rest of it was things I'd already heard, but there was a few things. I've mostly been sending to firmware places, but maybe I should try a few games outfits just for variety. I headed through the show floor, saw a few things but nothing I'd not heard of before, so headed off to grab some food, getting some sandwiches at Trader Joe's. When I got back, I found out the laptop booted but now would not charge, so something has gone quite wrong in there. It had about an hour's charge left, so I shut it down to save it just in case I need it. And maybe it will come back. Spoiler, it doesn't. Over lunch, I watched the Jackbox Party PAX. The cast was Jerry, Chris, and a few others. It was very entertaining. They announced TKO 2, which looked good. Annoyed about the laptop, I switched to the Steam Deck and realised I forgot to bring a keyboard, so that makes using it as a laptop replacement difficult. I played some Bayonetta, had dinner, watched some YouTube and some anime, and then went to bed. Day 3. I had real difficulty sleeping for some reason, and so overslept. Luckily, the panel I intended to go to was one that was streamed, so while I was waking up, I watched a panel on Cult of the Lamb. The main information was they had a new free update coming. They started doing a tier list of the follower types and got as far as the Axolotls followers, S tier, and were moving to Purple Twitch Mouse follower, and then their PC blue screened. They got things back up and running, but then their tier list crashed again, possibly caused by their tier list software being D-tier tier list software. They talked about some of the new features coming in the new update, Some of the stuff they'd wanted in the 1.0 version but not had time for, and discussed improvements post-release. By this point they gave up on the tier list as it was just not working and went to questions from their Discord. First was, will there be a Cult of the Lamb gamer drink? Followed by lots of poo questions. They then played a game of Fuck, Marry, Kill, Pray with mostly Cult of the Lamb NPCs. The final round ended with Duranda, the Lamb, the Red Angry Bird, and then Riz Lamb. The music and sound guy then played the flute for a bit. The music in Cult of the Lamb is really good, so it was nice to hear some, but unfortunately Twitch cut out mid-flute. Then it said broadcast ended. The flute killed the stream, too powerful. When it came back, they did a QA and got asked where this weird little cult simulator where you sacrifice villagers to an eldritch god came from. They said COVID was harsh and during lockdown they went a little crazy, so a game about a crazy cult just made sense. They went through a lot of ideas, a hell management game, a village on the back of the whale, and eventually narrowed it down to the game we see today. It was a fun if slightly chaotic panel. Then I got showered ready and headed down to the convention centre. It was colder today, even a bit grey and threatening rain, but it's still not too bad. I got by with just my hoodie. Still not much in the way of queues, I was right in. I went around the show floor looking at keyboards. There were quite a few options. I decided to get a nice one that I could then use as a replacement keyboard for my rig at home. The one I picked after going around bashing keys on any number of RGB keyboards was a Corsair K100 Air wireless mechanical low profile keyboard. I liked the low profile, which this was probably the only one of the type I liked, and they gave me all sorts of goodies with my purchase. A badge, a bag, a nice LED onion thing. Has good action and lights in all manner of R, G and B, possibly also W, as is sometimes the case on high-end LEDs. After getting that lot, I headed to the queue room for the Oxventures Live D&D. It was about an hour's wait, but not too bad. I played some Bayonetta and did a few bits and bobs. Then we loaded into the theatre. It was pretty full, but having come early, I got up near the front, maybe third row in the middle. The show kicked off with the usual crew: Luke as Dob, the half-elf bard, Ellen as Merylwen, the wood elf druid, Andy as Corazon, the rogue, Mike as Egbert, the dragonkin paladin. Standing for Jane/Prudence was Jasmine Bular as Morgaine the dwarf. There was DM Johnny Chiodini, who was everyone else in the world. The story involved the gang going to a town where a play about wolves in a certain geographic location was going on. This version, PAX East. There were a lot of shenanigans. Corazon disguised himself as Death, now canonically a robed figure with four arms and the skull of a sexy lady hippopotamus, and threatened to take the playwright to the other side unless payment could be arranged. They went to a pub with a direwolf dressed up to look like a pack of direwolves for stage effect and named Tikka Masala. This despite the bar's strict no pets policy. Small print. They didn't actually have the balls to stop you. Egbert, who has a spell that forces someone to tell the truth, instead used a command spell to make a stranger drink 3 pints so that they would be more open to telling them the truth. They learned of an assassination at the upcoming play and decided to foil it during the show, but rather than planning, they just drank more and went and did shots of a claymore. Later, when the show actually started, Corazon, who was playing the role of a shepherd, read his lines in the most extra fashion, but then goes off script claiming to be the vampire king of the direwolves and does a song. This pissed off the direwolves and they savaged him while Merylwen in direwolf form holds his mouth shut. Meanwhile, the others have forgotten that this was the cue for the assassination to begin and have to be reminded. They barely foil the first attack, with Dob ending up falling on the audience and Merylwen having to snatch a poison dart out of the air in eagle form. Yet slightly more prepared for the second assassin, whom Morgaine and Dob intercept and then kick to death. They find a note on him that says if the first 2 attempts fail, they are to go ham. And at this point, several assassins dramatically unsheath their swords and throw some sort of vial at the target. Corazon, who is dressed as a dancer for another attempt at his breakout role, engages one of them and then proclaims himself son of the king of the direwolves, the prince of the direwolves, and is avenging his father. Egbert propels one of the assassins into the stage pyro and launches him into space. He also manages to launch 7 audience members with him. Merylwen secures 3 of the assassins with an ensnare spell that probably ensnares quite a few audience members, and the first assassin, who has just been sitting in his box, forgotten, fires a fireball, but it screws up and sets the theatre on fire. At this point, the vial of gunk turns out to be some sort of animal pheromone and causes the ghost tiger, called Somoza, to leap out of backstage into the box and start savaging the target and his entourage. One of the assassins decides to become a baker instead. The mage in the box has another go and blows out the floor and falls down prone. Egbert decides to throw a bomb at the ghost tiger, which lands exactly where he aimed it. Unfortunately, the blast radius takes out the target. The party gets respect from the assassins for a job well done. They flee the now on fire and partially blown up theatre. A job well done indeed. It was very, very entertaining, and the way it just went wrong and seemed to sort of spiral out of control was the best sort of fun. Grabbed something to eat and then headed back to my hotel. I'd missed lunch, what with being late and the various times of things, so I had a few sandwiches for a late lunch, early dinner. It was actually raining a bit at this point, but I made my way back, and since it's just across the road, it wasn't really an issue. I set up the new keyboard, it worked pretty well, and was usable even with the small screen of the Steam Deck. I just needed to bump the font up a little to not strain my eyes. I watched a panel on the psychology of Elden Ring, although Twitch was being a bit rubbish, and I lost about half of it. I also tried Chromecasting it to the TV, which didn't seem to work beyond a brief burst at the beginning. I ate my food, watched the panel, and played some Diablo 4 beta, which was open beta this weekend. Next up was Acquisitions Incorporated Live D&D, and I actually got the Twitch TV thing to work at this point. They began with a nice animation of the events of the last arc, which involved a rocket and a time-travelling teddy bear. The party was Jerry Holkins as Omen Dran, Jasmine Bula as his daughter Certainty Dran, WWE superstar Xavier Woods as Bobby Zewarowski, Anna Prosser as Evelyn, and then Jeremy Crawford as the DM and also Vi the Goblin Artificer. They arrive at an unknown city and all their powers are not working, and after a while DM Jeremy starts acting confused, claiming they've lost the plot. He then stood up, and then Chris Perkins, the old DM, the original daddy as the screen says, emerged from the back to take over while Jeremy joined the party. They have all reverted to level 3, and Chris says he's prepared a game for level 18, so it may be a short session. The story revolved around them being in a somewhat parallel world to their normal one, with things similar but not quite the same as normal. They found an old hideout device and broke in, and then had to contend with some sort of portal thing that kept teleporting them randomly. They fought a coffee machine mech and a furnace that had been brought to life, and the talking horse told them about the weather. Jerry was having some really bad rolls, like 1, 5 and a 3. He tried to hit this monster, rolled a 1, and then he tries to get out of it using his abilities. Perkins let him get all the way through his plan to save the turn, and then reminds him that a natural 1 is always a miss. Then he had a machine fall on him and channel the weapon damage through him. Then the thing starts ticking like a bomb, and through a series of turns, all but one person ends up in the room with it. Thankfully, Certainty manages to aim it at a lizard man, who seems to be a mutated version of some of Vi's apprentices, and turns him to sludge. They open a vault with a mechanism that involved caressing orbs. They find a journal which talks about the rock that they found in the robo-furnace. They learn it's a temporal anomaly and part of a pillar. They learn the artificers were planning to crack the rock open, and that's where the journal ends. It was a fun game, and I really enjoyed it. Somewhat less chaotic than the X-Venture game earlier. They talked about how Chris and Jeremy did not talk about the game. They were so committed to the secret DM and Jeremy as a player that they made sure not to talk about it. Jay said that he had no idea Chris was running the game, and it came as a complete shock. I played some more Diablo 4, which was pretty unstable on the Steam Deck. It would run basically fine, and then after going to town it would lock the deck up. Not ideal, but I got my character to level 20 and unlocked the beta cosmetics. I did want to try some of the other characters, but given how wonky it was, I don't think it's worth the pain to do so. I watched some videos and turned in for the night. Day 4. Final day of PAX East. I got up in time for my first panel, but somehow managed to almost end up being late. But being just across the road, and with the general quickness of getting into the convention centre this PAX, it saved me from missing the start. Though as it turned out, this was not exactly a packed panel. This being Sunday and the last day of PAX, it's not a hugely popular time slot. The panel was called Minesweeper, the Book, the Reading, and was essentially a promo for this upcoming book by journalist Kyle Orland. It detailed the history of Minesweeper, how it was one of the very few games almost every PC had installed by default, and as a result is one of the most played PC games in existence. He covered how it was developed, taking inspiration from a bunch of other games, including the Spectrum game called Mind Out, which had a similar idea but is somewhat less streamlined and with more deaths, and how Microsoft at the time was reluctant to include it in their operating system, as it was seen as a time waster, given Windows was serious business for serious adults, not this kid stuff. Luckily, Bill Gates himself got addicted to the game, to the point that Melinda French, his then girlfriend, now ex-wife, had the developer no longer distribute high scores, as Bill was wasting a lot of time trying to beat them. Eventually, the programmer created a script that clicked the top corner and then the new grain button repeatedly till they got a board that gave them a win in under a second, and then it became the new unbeatable high score. Indeed, speedrunners discovered that in the game there is what they call a dream board, which on harder difficulties gives you a win very quickly, as the clusters of mine are such that you solve almost all the board in seconds. The stream board is also more easy to get than pure chance would suggest, due to some peculiarity in the random number generator, only requiring some 15,000 clicks to get it. The addictiveness and potential time wasting of these bundled games led to a moral panic about employees wasting company time. Several big companies had the games removed from their systems, and even some went as far as to remove MS Paint, and presumably had to ban pen and paper in their offices too. There was even a bill in Congress to remove these devil games from all federal computers. It didn't pass. In the Q&A, when asked why he chose to write about Minesweeper of all possible games, he replied that in terms of the number of people that had played and continue to play the game, versus the amount of things written about it, he felt like Minesweeper had a very interesting ratio. Almost nothing has been written about it, yet it's one of the most played PC games. It was a pretty fun talk. I'll have to look out for the book. It sounded like there was a lot more in there in terms of interesting content. After that, I walked the floor for a bit, and then my next panel was More Than Kid Stuff, How Video Games Predict Business Trends. It was an interesting talk with a mix of business people, one analysis, one more in the making experience hand end of things, a woman from IBM who was their global cybersecurity manager, and then a college professor teaching games design, among other things. They made some interesting points, showing that current things like software as a service are basically an MMO, something we've had in games for decades now. Remote collaboration is something games have been doing for a long while, but it's something business has been slow to adopt, at least until they were forced to, and how some of the metaphors and imagery of the office can be used in that environment, like having virtual offices with doors that are open to indicate someone is open to having a chat, or some such, or shut to indicate you're busy. The lady from IBM showed some of their cybersecurity training space, a simulated sort of war room thing where they can simulate a company coming under cyber attack, with all levels of people then having to respond with things like mock reporters or other things to let people experience how that sort of event plays out in a safe and fairly possible way. They showed some tech that did augmented reality or virtual production stuff, which they called XR, and they had things like directing an industrial robot using AR to do pathing, setting up or troubleshooting an industrial machine with AR. They discussed how this tech could be used to do knowledge capture/transfer of people's skills when they're leaving an industry or retiring. They also talked about how most of the current gamified stuff is just crap. It's all points and quizzes and leaderboards, which do nothing, and is basically a misunderstanding of why games are compelling. It was a pretty interesting panel, and made some good points on how gaming is a powerful tool when used correctly, and has pioneered a lot of the business trends. They did mention the dreaded metaverse, which people keep pushing, and I'm not sure it's going to be that useful given how hard that's crashing and burning. The next panel was called Exploring Boston Through Games and History. In the queue, one of the enforcers asked for Boston facts, and a guy said they don't like the British here. And this other guy shouted, "Damn right," and then started talking about how the US Constitution being great, and then ranting and getting all worked up and basically a bit belligerent. The enforcers gently closed that down and then told him to stop. He seemed maybe a little drunk. Later in the panel, he also asked a question about Paul Revere and how he got all the credit when he actually got pinched, unlike some of the other guys. Of course, the reality of it was more about the poem by Longfellow that picked him as the hero way after the actual events, and even then that was more about the events of those times rather than the actual midnight ride. The panel had a mix of things from scholarly uses of game text to recreate people or places, using games more like a live-action roleplay to make historic events more accessible, and then looking at how historical places and buildings are depicted in games, as well as a general look at games made in the area. First up, they had Jessica Linker, Assistant Professor of History at Northeastern University, who talked about using Unity to recreate historic places that have been destroyed or are no longer in their historic condition or would be impractical to explore. They had a project recreating the house of a famous black abolitionist, David Walker, who published a pamphlet called The Appeal, and they were using Unity to rebuild it in VR and on the web. Liam McLean, PhD student at Northeastern University, was doing something somewhat similar but exploring the Triangle Factory fire in New York, one of America's worst industrial disasters. Again, recreating the structure in VR and on the web to allow students to get a feel for what the place was like and the events that occurred there. Next they had Daoud Al-Azaya, founder of Curious Experience Design, who talked about a live-action role-play, ARG-ish game a museum ran on the anniversary of the Stamp Act. It was an attempt to bring those events to life, with several people acting as historic NPCs of different classes around Boston people could visit and then get stamps from, and learn their opinions on the act, culminating on a march on the town hall with an effigy of the man supposed to issue the stamps, and then resignation of that fellow. They then had Christopher Marie, engineering manager SkyMap Games, who talked about local game devs both past and present. He showed people like Looking Glass Games, Irrational Games, and the Molasses Flood. Finally, Peter Knowlton, PhD senior lecturer at Rhode Island School of Design, showed some games set in Boston, with Fallout 4 being heavily featured. He showed some of the buildings and how they had been recreated in the game, with some of the adjustments, and talked about how the spatial adjustments Bethesda did to make Boston smaller. It was an interesting panel. After that, I worked the show floor for a bit, didn't play anything, the queues were still pretty long, although I could have tried out unannounced, upcoming, untitled train game from THQ Nordic. This had 2 free machines when I passed, the only open computers I actually came across, but I saw the other screens and it didn't really look like my sort of thing. Also, it didn't seem to include any trains in the gameplay I saw. I went up to the queue for the Omegathon final round and was handed a pair of 3D glasses, the paper red and blue Anaglyph 3D kind. Was told to put them on and stare intently at the stage once they started as part of a prank. They were labelled Polar Express. When I asked why, I was told they ordered polarised with express shipping, but there was a bit of a mix-up. As it turned out, nothing came of this. Either no one on the stage noticed people wearing 3D glasses, or they just didn't care. The game for this year's Omegathons to play was Toaster Ball. Basically football, but where you were a toaster. You can move the ball by jumping your toaster or hit it with toast. It was pretty chaotic, and each of the small levels had these different modifiers, like small toasters, moving floor, icy floor, and wind blowing the toasters, basketball hoops instead of goals, and a few more. It was an ideal for a final round like this, and I think a high percentage of the goals scored were actually own goals. After that, it was just down to the housekeeping of thanking people and then closing down for another year. I headed out with everyone else. The weather had turned nice, the sun was just setting, and it was a pretty good way to end things. I headed over to Trader Joe's to grab a few bits for dinner. I'm still here for the rest of the week, although I have to change hotels on Tuesday, which will be annoying. Still, if the weather's not too bad tomorrow, I might walk out to Fort Independence, since I'm pretty close at the moment. I don't think I've ever been there, at least not in the real world. I hope there are at least less Mirelurks or super mutants in the real one. In the evening, I watched a bunch of episodes of some History Channel program about the food and brands that built America. The history of Starbucks was one episode. I hadn't realised the crossover with Pete's Coffee, KFC and Wendy's, Popeyes and Chick-fil-A, and then there was a thing on Wrigley's Gum and the American Chiclet Company. It was all kind of fascinating. Day 5. The forecast had said it was going to rain, but it was actually a pretty nice day, and later on I regretted taking my PAX jacket with me. I decided to walk out to Castle Island at Fort Independence, as I've never been out and visited there. It was a fair walk, maybe 45 minutes or so, but the weather was pleasant. I got to the shoreline and the various parks there around the lake, and then headed out to the fort. It's both impressive and somewhat disappointing in that it's just this huge imposing structure, but it's basically just a huge square block that just barely pokes out of the hill it's on. It's actually 5-sided, I think, but that's very hard to tell from the ground. Some of the sides have cannons sticking out, but that's about the extent of any detail. You don't seem to be allowed inside, which is a pity. That might have been a bit more interesting. I did step into the entrance where a gate barred me from going any further, and got a quick look around at the interior where there were cannons and some various things around. I'm not sure if I was actually supposed to go in there, as later the door was shut, so perhaps they'd left it open as there were some rangers about doing ranger stuff. I didn't see any Mirelurks or super mutants. I did inspect the rangers and they were wearing green, but seemed normal, non-mutated size and lacked claws or shell. I walked round the fort taking in the views. It's quite pretty out there. You can see the sea and the downtown area and then out to the various islands. It's also just across from the airport, so you get to see planes coming in every 5 minutes or so. I grabbed a bite to eat, getting a crab cake sandwich, small fries and a drink for a somewhat outrageous $20 at the Tourist Trap restaurant. The food was okay, it kept me going. I had to walk along the front and then down to a small park that's there and then headed back to my hotel, getting back around 3 p.m. I recovered, got some dinner, and then watched a bunch of World's Greatest Mysteries presented by Lawrence Fishburne, which were all over the map in terms of content. One was on the Tylenol murders, a series of unsolved cyanide poisonings in Chicago in the 1980s that killed 8 people, which led to the tamper-proof seals that were placed on all medicines. They told the story and then speculated on who did it, but it's still an open case. They then switched to historical mysteries and discussed the Antikythera mechanism. This one really went off the deep end. First saying no one knows how it works and it can't be made with today's technology, which is not really true. I've seen there's a chap on YouTube who's building a replica. Then it got real wild with them saying it was made by aliens or a time machine, and it was all pretty silly. It's an amazing piece of history and it does challenge some of the assumptions about the level of technology at the time, but it's not magical. Most of the reasons we don't understand it is it's incomplete and fused together in silt and rust and other crap from where it was sitting at the bottom of the ocean. Anyway, I did some packing and then settled in to get some sleep. Day 6. I had to move hotels today, so I got up at a reasonable time, got washed, dressed, did the last bits of packing, and then checked to make sure I didn't leave anything. The weather returned. It was raining pretty constantly by the time I got checked out and on my way. My new hotel is the Hotel Akka, which is just next to the Boston Common on the corner with Park Street Church, just a little bit further in. For some reason, Hotwire had requested a handicap-capable room for me, which I told them I didn't need and thus opened a lot of options. They were nice enough to get me a room even though it was 4.5 hours before check-in, and I got a pretty nice corner room which had a good view of the church and part of the common. I dried off a bit, got unpacked, and got myself set up, then played a bit of Bayonetta, and when the weather cleared up a bit, went out for some supplies. Had to get a new SD card, because the one I got in my little camera had run out of space. I went to Staples to pick up the card, and then headed back via Walgreens to pick up a few things like drinks, lunch, and some snacks. Played the rest of Bayonetta 3, finishing it finally, and then watched some history shows about a weird island called The Curse of Oak Island, where a bunch of people puzzled over walls and dug up a few nails and a hook. I'm not sure what the cursed aspect was, and it was more or less just Time Team but American. The final program I watched was somewhat fortuitous. It was about an unsolved mystery of the robbery of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum in the 1990s. Fortuitous because I plan to visit the museum tomorrow. The robbery took place just after St. Patrick's Day, the early morning hours of March 18, 1990. And one of the original conditions of the will that set up the museum is that nothing can be permanently moved, added, or taken away, and it has to stay exactly as it was laid out by Mrs. Gardner. As such, there is a bit of a dilemma in terms of protecting the paintings, and the security at the time was not great, with only very basic motion detectors and a few cameras. Thieves got in by dressing as police and then just asking to come in because of a disturbance. The guards should have said no, but instead let them in, and so then they just got the 2 night guards tied up, and they were free to roam the museum at will, which they did. They went on a rampage, cutting paintings out of their frames, stealing drawings, and also the finial on top of a flagpole. They were in there a total of 81 minutes, which is a pretty long time, and there didn't seem to be any reasoning behind what they took. A lot of it was valuable, but other stuff, not so much. And they had a long time in there where they could have just taken more or selectively picked things that were really valuable. Two of the most notable paintings are a Vermeer and a Rembrandt, one of his few sea scenes. They left the guards duct tape up in the basement, took the printout off the room's motion tracker, although it was still stored on the PC it was connected to, so we didn't know which rooms they were in and when, and then took the tapes for the cameras and left. The robbery was discovered the next morning when the day shift guards came in and no one buzzed them in. The paintings have never been found and no one has been charged with the crime. There were a few suspects, but pretty much all of them died, and not usually of natural causes. It's incredible that paintings from such well-known Dutch masters could vanish without trace for going on 30 years. After that, I got some sleep. Day 7. Today I went to the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. I had my tickets booked and needed to get there for 1 PM, and it was about an hour's walk over there. I was leaving at about 11:30, so I had plenty of time. I could have taken an Uber or rode the T part of the way, but the route took me through the centre of Boston, and it was a very nice day, so I figured a leisurely stroll and some pictures of the sights would do well. I wandered over the Common and saw the weird hand-shoulder sculpture thing that I'm not sure I understand. Supposedly it's a hug or something, but the people are just arms. It's a bit strange. The park was absolutely full of squirrels frolicking about, grabbing food. You would turn around and 3 or 4 squirrels would come running out of a bush. I walked through Copley Square and then out to the Fens and wandered down to where the museum was. I got there with about half an hour to kill, and so sat down on a nearby bench, enjoying the pleasant weather. When it was time, I headed in, and it's a very odd museum, not quite like any art museum that I've been to. Isabella Stewart Gardner was a very wealthy woman and patron of the arts, who personally put together the collection, positioning the pieces, and then set up a fund to keep it running after her death in 1924, leaving the museum for the education and enjoyment of the public forever. Her will stipulated that nothing in the gallery should be changed, and no items be acquired or sold from the collection. Moving through the museum, there were a few items missing, with a plaque stating that such and such was on loan, but there were also several empty frames. These are the famous stolen paintings and drawings which were taken in a robbery in the 1990s and have never been recovered. But their places are still there, just empty, waiting for the paintings to return. Entering the museum, you arrive in a courtyard, a massive open space filled with plants and a huge skylight on the roof 3 stories up. Statues and a mosaic with an image of Medusa, as well as a fountain, fill the courtyard. The museum's floors are all around this internal space, with balconies and windows looking down into it. The roof is made with a UV filtering glass to protect the paintings, and as such the plants are in pots so that they can be rotated out to get sunlight and recover. The museum itself was never Mrs. Gardner's home. Although she had a small apartment on the top floor, it was always meant to be a museum. It also hosted artists in some of the studios and apartments on the top floor. The rooms are all laid out as Isabella Stewart Gardner designed, and there is nothing in the way of prompts or theme suggestions. She wanted people to make their own minds up about the space, to find their own little things and make connections on their own. The museum does have a sort of guided tour thing accessible via QR codes in most of the rooms, and it was nice to learn a little something about what I was looking at, as otherwise nothing is labelled or highlighted. There is a bit of a sense of overload too, in that each room has many paintings of different themes, varied and vague, and there's a riot of colours, with a red room, a blue room, a yellow room, and massive long hallways covered in tapestries, other rooms all covered in wooden choir seats taken from a church somewhere, or large paintings covering every surface. Everywhere you look, there is something. It's a very impressive museum with a lot of amazing paintings from people like Rembrandt, Botticelli. They used to have a Vermeer, which is one of the stolen paintings, and a host of others, even someone like me, not an expert in art, can recognise. They also have artefacts and furniture and statues and various other things all over the place, all in this amazing building which is as much a work of art as the items in it. It was a very fun place to visit, although I did end up feeling a little overwhelmed with all the stuff to see there. The audio tour did help me dial it in a little, with showing me a few things and telling me some stories. It made the experience a bit more easy to digest and less just gawping at walls and walls and walls of paintings. After that I walked back to the hotel, grabbed some lunch/dinner, as it was coming up on 4 by this point. I watched some more History Channel, hoping for another recommendation on some obscure historic place I could visit tomorrow, but instead got a bunch of episodes of Porn Stars, which didn't suggest anything. I played some Diablo 2 and Terra Nil, and then called it a night. Day 8. I got up a little late. I spent too long balancing ecologies and Terra Nil, and so went to bed a bit late as a result. It was another nice day, and I thought maybe a trip up the Prudential building to see the city would be nice, as it was pretty bright and clear. However, a bit of Googling later, I discovered that the viewing deck has been closed since 2020, and though it may open this year, it isn't open yet. I looked for other tall things, and the Bunker Hill Memorial was suggested. I had a nice walk over the river via an alarmingly flexible temporary bridge, which was just sort of welded to the side of the road bridge while they were doing repairs. The day was bright and clear, but the temperature dropped significantly, reading 3 degrees, and the wind had really picked up. Out of the sun it was pretty cold, and my hands got the worst of it, but wrapping up in a hoodie I was fine. Last time I visited Bunker Hill a few years ago, it was all fenced off as they were refurbishing it. Now it's all open again. However, my timing was not ideal, as I arrived just as a huge group of school kids were going up. I wandered the base of the thing, taking in the sights and reading the plaques, hoping they would clear out and I could climb the many stairs up to the top. But as soon as it looked like they were almost done with their multiple groups, another huge gang of school kids turned up. I guess today is the day that schools visit the thing, so I gave up and walked over to the USS Constitution. Old Ironsides, as she is known, was also in better shape than the last time I saw her. I wandered the deck and the 2 below decks with increasingly low ceilings, seeing all the cannons and stuff inside the ship. There was also the USS Cassin Young, a World War II Fletcher-class destroyer, one of only 4 left afloat. She wasn't open, but I took some pictures of the outside of the ship. I wandered the dock, which had some great views of the city, and then headed back, this time going over the Gridley Locks footpath, which goes over the locks themselves rather than using the temporary bridge. Grabbing some sandwiches for lunch at a nearby 7-Eleven, I got a Cape Cod chicken salad, which I thought was chicken mayo and red onions, judging by the appearance, but actually turned out to be chicken mayo and dried cranberries. It was an experience. I ate some lunch, played some Diablo 2, and then watched a documentary on Decentraland called The Future is a Dead Mole, which was by Folding Ideas, the guy who did a great piece called The Line Goes Up, breaking down NFTs. This builds on that, as Decentraland is one of those virtual real estate things where they claim to be a metaverse but are really just a crap video game. Day 9. The previous night's TV shows were all about hunting snakes and or crocodiles in the swamps. And I'm not sure there are any places like that in the Boston area, so not really that useful for suggestions of places to visit. Instead, I went to an old favourite, the Boston Museum of Science. It was a touch warmer today, still bright and clear, but the forecast said it would rain later in the day, so I took my jacket with me. At points I regretted this as it was a touch too warm, but then on the way home the freezing cold rain started, and so it was worth the earlier warmth. The Boston Science Museum is one of my favourites. They have some fun exhibits and do lots of hands-on or live shows, and they have a planetarium and an omnimax. One of the exhibits I really enjoy is the demo of the original 3 stories tall Van de Graaff generator, built by the man himself, and fully capable of shooting bolts of electricity over a distance of a metre or more. They do a show demonstrating the principles, showing some examples of how it works, and even show a few cameras inside the machine itself. They sit an operator in a cage and then raise it up to the twin domes of the machine, and the operator demonstrates the skin effect by touching the inside of the cage while it's being struck by bolts of electricity. They have a few Tesla coils and even one that they can tune to make notes. It's great fun and I enjoy seeing it every time. Next, I went to a show in the Charles Hayden Planetarium called Destination Mars, The New Frontier, which to be honest was a bit disappointing. It was basically all 3D visuals of Mars, Earth, the space station and various other NASA things, like the assembly building, the space launch system, the Orion module, and a couple of SpaceX things. It was all projected on the large dome screen and narrated by the dulcet tones of Keith David. I wish they'd used at least some real footage instead of what was actually fairly low detail renderings with flat textures. After that, I explored the exhibits, and I saw a live animal show where they had a rainbow constrictor snake, which is a medium-sized res snake with black patterns, the rainbow of its name being due to structural colour on some of its scales that gives them sort of a rainbow sheen. It was pretty fun to see. I looked at some of the robots. They had a Boston Dynamics Spot the dog, which would march around a loop of various terrain and then plug back into its power. They had a few things from MIT, a cheetah robot. They had an exhibit on the human body and various old school stuffed animals, gems, rocks, fossils and models. They had some wonderful Triceratops skeletons. There were also lots of little hands-on things on senses, illusion or other little science demos, all of which were good fun. For the final thing, I went to a showing of ancient caves in the Omnimax Theatre. It was pretty fun, lots of cave diving scenes, showing the weird structures and so on, as the divers made their way through these tight, dangerous underwater environments, and at quite large depths that required some quite long decompression. It was something that worked quite well in the Omnivax format. After that, I exited through the gift shop and didn't buy anything. I considered getting a mug, but wasn't sure it would survive the trip back. The rain started in earnest at this point, and it was bitterly cold with the wind, and now that the sun was gone. I was glad for my coat. I walked back, grabbing some dinner on the way. Day 10. I got up a little later and sorted myself out, and as I was doing so, I discovered my little gimbal camera was broken and could no longer move in all directions, with the camera part of it hitting part of the arm. I'm not sure how this happened. I remember it toppling over yesterday, but not from any great height or distance, and to fix it I had to apply an alarming amount of force to bend the frame back into shape, so not sure how it managed to get bent that way in the first place. Still, I got it mostly working again and headed out. I decided to go and visit the MIT Museum. It's part advertisement from MIT and part actual museum, and relatively small, but the entrance fee was not hideous, so I gave it a go. It was a wet and grey day, and so I was back to wearing a coat. The views over the Charles River were pretty good. You can see the skyline and of course MIT itself. I walked over to the museum and wandered through it. It had a lot of stuff they'd built or invented either historically or recently. Then going up a floor they had some kinetic sculptures and then a whole area on AI. There were lots of gadgets and things from Claude Shannon, who invented information theory among other things. He also built various machines, like a juggling machine and a machine that could play chess called Endgame. There was a section on the interface between art and science with some very weird stuff, like a project to engineer a pink chicken. I'm not sure how serious some of these projects were. A lot seemed to be more performative than actual projects. It was a fun little museum, and once I was done, I took a walk out to look at the main MIT building, and then along the Charles River to look at downtown Boston. There was some sort of thing going on in the Charles River Esplanade, a sort of island that parallels the shore for a little bit that you can walk or jog along. Today it was closed off with huge groups of people hanging around and trucks filled with what looked like ice or snow. A large camera car with a long boom camera mounted on the end with a 3-axis gimbal. I'm not sure what it was about, probably some TV or film thing perhaps. There had to be something like 50 people just hanging around doing nothing, so not sure what was going on. I walked back via Copley Square and then the Common, grabbing some lunch along the way. The sun was starting to come out and it was warming up quite a bit. It was somehow still raining. I spent the rest of the day playing some Diablo 3 and packing my stuff. My flight back home is tomorrow, so I need to get everything ready to go. Have some time tomorrow as the flight is in the afternoon. It's been a good trip, a fun break away from job hunting. Monday I have my exit interview and final day, although because of the way things have been, I've not really done any work there since the end of February beyond a few meetings and things for the placement agency. I've got some interviews booked next week, and one of the companies is supposedly sending over tests for me to do. I guess it will get back to some normality. I've mostly been ignoring anything about job stuff since I've been out here, beyond flagging a few emails and such to follow up once I'm back. I think getting away and just having some fun times gaming and attending panels on gaming, then doing a bit of tourist stuff has been good for my feelings of well-being, so I'm glad I decided to do this. Day 11. Today was the end of my trip to Boston, but my flight wasn't until 5 PM, so I had some time. It was a nice day, bright, sunny, but a bit cold, maybe 5 degrees, and out of the sun and with the wind it was pretty chilly. I wandered the Common, took a few pictures, puzzled out the strange embrace sculpture, and then headed over to the seaport area and wandered the front there for a bit. I took a bus out to the airport, got my bag dropped off, and then went through security. Things were quiet, not much in the way of queues, and I was soon at the gate and settled in to wait for the flight. They had a pretty full plane, with almost all the seats taken, and it seemed like almost everyone on board had their roller bag, some of which were clearly too large for cabin baggage, so bin space was at a premium. Since I'd checked my bag and just had my backpack of toys, and I'd gotten premium seats and got on early-ish, I had no trouble putting my stuff away. The flight back was a little longer than the flight out, presumably due to air currents or something, but at 6 hours 40 minutes, it was not the worst. Getting into the unpleasant length, but still short of an international flight. I guess you're crossing the whole of the US, so it may be one of the longer internal flights beyond flying to somewhere like Hawaii or Alaska. We arrived at about 9:40 local time in the evening. For some reason, SFO was absolutely rammed with people. The baggage claim was also crazy. They seemed to be dumping all the bags for about 10 different flights onto the one belt, and so it was 5 people deep at the edge. I managed to pick up an identical but not mine bag and then had to wrestle my way back to the belt to return it. Black suitcases of that design seemed to be fairly common. Eventually I got my actual bag and made my way to the Uber pickup point and booked a car to take me home. My driver, Yuri Allen, was a character. He told me he was from Georgia and was a carpenter who also did Uber on the weekends. His wife apparently told him to go to work and work more. He tried to guess where I was from, picking places like Arizona, and then I told him I was from the UK and he suggested Manchester. We discussed the woeful state of the UK politics, and then we drove the rest of the way listening to some 80s ballads. He told me to drink some whiskey and sleep, then work the next day. I told him tomorrow is my last day at work and they'd fired us all. He said he expected I would be able to find work soon, and if not, perhaps I could try Uber myself. I got home, got my stuff mostly unpacked, and then hit the hay, as I have my exit interview at 9 AM tomorrow, and then an interview and perhaps an online code test, so pretty full day ahead of me. It's been a great trip out to Boston, a fun PAX and then some good time mooching about. It was good to relax and not really think about the rest of the nonsense.